Last night, we saw Jesus beaten and hung on a cross. We haven't got to that part in church yet, but we watched the Passion of the Christ at our home last night. It's kind of been a tradition that, and I didn't realize this until this morning, that movie came out 20 years ago in 2004. And every year we try to watch it and have done so most of that time in the last 20 years. I remember going to see that with our home church, St. Mary's. We had a group that went to see it and gathered back for discussions afterwards. And it was tough discussions when we got back. I don't know that anyone really knew what to expect when they saw that movie. We thought, well, this is supposed to be like one of the most accurate portrayals of what happens to Jesus and the Passion that has ever been out. But I don't think anyone was prepared to see just how gritty and realistic it was. There are a lot of friends that I have, especially Episcopal friends, who have never seen the movie, who really have no desire to see the movie. There are a lot who call it violence porn, in that people like to watch it just to see the gratuitous violence. That, I would say, I would push back on that. I would say that it is a very, very realistic portrayal of what Jesus likely went through during the Passion. There's also a really interesting angle to the movie, besides us being participants and watching it from the beginning when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane until he gets to the cross, is that his mother, Mary, is kind of on the periphery of the entire event. So she's awakened after they arrested him, and she's there at the courtyard. She's always on the periphery, never able to get quite close enough to be with Jesus. And so a lot of it we see through her eyes, seeing as he's at the home of the high priest and they're trying to plot against him, seeing him as he's at the trial in front of Pilate with the crowd shouting to crucify, with him as he is being scourged in the courtyard. The scourging is probably the most violent part of the movie, and really the most gritty and realistic. When we hear this gospel reading like we did just a few moments ago, and talk about he was whipped and beaten, it gives no idea to the extremes that it likely was. Scourging in its own was enough to kill a person. I mean, it's not, if you watch a movie, say, of slavery and see someone whipped and beaten, which is horrific on its own, imagine something 10 times worse. These whips, including pieces of metal and glass and broken pottery, meant to dig in and inflict as much pain, to flay open someone as they whipped and pulled against the skin. Again, enough to sometimes kill a person. From that point, being forced to carry his cross outside the city to the hill, and probably one of the most painful parts of the movie to watch, and the part, interesting, that I can remember getting emotional about 20 years ago, still the part that really gets me the most now. So I mentioned his mother, Mary, that part of this is kind of watching her on the periphery this entire time. Well, as he's walking through the streets, Mary is kind of walking along in these side streets, looking at these different alleys, seeing Jesus pass by, and looking for the opportunity where she can get close to him, and never quite finding it until one of the moments when Jesus falls carrying the cross. And Mary rushes down one of these side streets because the soldiers, the crowds are closing in. The soldiers are a little distracted and they're kind of watching the crowds. And so Jesus is left unattended. And Mary is having this flashback to young Jesus, maybe 3 or 4 years old, who falls down on a pavement. And like any mother, obviously is concerned, and she's rushing over to scoop infant Jesus up in her arms and to give him comfort. Well, and maybe it's because the reason that is the emotional part for me is because of a parent, you know, seeing those moments uh, where your children are hurt or injured, and there's nothing you can do except try to offer them comfort. And the pain that gives you as a parent. So that's the one time that Mary is able to kind of go and be at the side of Jesus, something we don't hear in the gospel, but something that they add to the movie, which I think gives it such poignancy in that particular scene. Then the movie, again, picks back up with Jesus carrying his cross to Golgotha and being nailed to it. Again, it's a challenging thing, especially for Episcopalians. We don't like to focus on the cross of the sacrifice. We like to focus on the cross of the resurrection, the cross that doesn't see Jesus hanging from it. And I'm often asked, why is it that when I wear a cross, it's a crucifix? Why do I have one with Jesus on it and not a plain cross? And I guess the thinking is that the plain cross really symbolizes the resurrection, that Jesus is off the cross. And the reason why I wear the crucifix is to remember the sacrifice of the cross, the work that Jesus does for taking on all of our sins, placing those on himself, and accomplishing the job that we can't do on our own. And it's interesting that, again, we like to look towards the resurrection. We like to look towards the Sunday morning, and we call ourselves a resurrection people, and that's true, and we are. But we don't get to the resurrection without first going through Good Friday. And Father Dave Thomas, he said this in a sermon a couple of years ago, and we often refer back to it because it's really stuck with us, is that you can't get to Easter morning without going through Good Friday. It is the work on the cross that gets us to Easter morning. And sometimes I think that we do it a disservice by not focusing on it as much. St. Paul, the early church fathers, for them, it is all about what happens on the cross, the crucifixion. More so the focus that we hear from them to where we get to in resurrection. I wonder what they thought as they were lowering that body down from the cross. Beaten, broken, bloodied, an ignoble end to something that had been so wonderful for the past 3 years or so of his public ministry. And how confusing it probably was to them to have this Roman centurion, a Gentile, off to the side saying that surely this was God's son. C.S. Lewis wrote that it was almost, the coming of Jesus is almost like a soldier being placed behind enemy lines, that he is placed clandestinely, kind of below the radar. And I listened to a really interesting sermon a few years ago by Bishop Bob Barron, and he talked about, even from the very beginning, that the world has turned against Jesus. From his birth, Herod tries to have him killed, kills all the young boys in Bethlehem. From the outset of his public ministry, it's the Pharisees who are going around trying to incite the people against him, all the way to Holy Week. His trusted friend and one of his disciples betrays him. He's in the temple preaching throughout Holy Week. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the scribes, the chief priests, everyone speaking out against Jesus, trying to turn public sentiment against him. Peter, James, and John, who can't seem to even stay awake for an hour with him when he prays in the garden. After his arrest, the other 11 disciples who all abandoned him, who run away, with the exception of John, who is there at the cross with Mary, his mother. The ultimate injustice of the Sanhedrin plotting against him and getting him to Pilate to be crucified. And then again, this ignoble end on the cross. And I wonder how many of them there, Mary and her sister Mary and Mary Magdalene and John the disciple, if they thought that was the end of the story. That it had all come to this. Again, we are Easter people, and we are resurrection people, and we know that that is not the end of the story, but really it's just the end of a chapter. And then tomorrow evening, we're going to gather back here, and we're going to realize it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the close of that portion. And we're going to see the rest of the story unfold, and we're going to see a new story beginning. I hope Good Friday brings with it a lot of conflicting memories for us, a lot of conflicted feelings for us, shame for our own part in this, even though we weren't there personally. Is that, in our lives, how many times do we reject Jesus, reject what Jesus has tried to teach us to do? There's some shame, there's guilt by association. Usually we would encourage you to not, feel guilt, to accept the forgiveness that we're given. But maybe on this one day, maybe live with that a little bit and think about how it is that we separate ourselves from Jesus. And again, come back tomorrow and realize that we are forgiven from that guilt. But let's live with Good Friday and not try to bypass it as quickly as we sometimes are off to do. Let's live into it today and take it for what it is. And remember, again, that it's not the end of the story. It's just the end of this one chapter. Come back tomorrow for the rest of it.